Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 36, Epistemic Access. How we know the language that writes us. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We now continue our profound journey through Episode 8, the pure abstract language of the Holophase audio series, moving to Part 36, Epistemic Access, How We Know the Language That Writes Us, in Book 8-9, The Bridge to Physics. We stand at the final section of our bridge. We have come so far. We have built the entire abstract language from a single seed. We have explored the gap between perfect abstraction and physical reality. We have built a translation dictionary between the symbols of phi and the measurable quantities of physics. We have seen how a reality filter selects only certain patterns from the infinite library of possibilities and allows those patterns to become the stable content of our world. Now we face the most intimate and mysterious question of all. How does a pattern within the language come to know the language itself? You, listening right now, are not outside this story. You are a complex pattern of phi, a living tapestry of derivatives woven into the form of a mind that can ask questions, imagine possibilities, and search for meaning. The very language that writes you is the same language you are trying to understand. You are a sentence in a book, trying to read the book in which you appear. This is the problem of epistemic access. How do we, as patterns within phi, gain knowledge about phi? How do we glimpse the language that writes us? What can we genuinely know, and where does our knowledge necessarily stop? This is not just a philosophical curiosity. This is the foundation of all science, all knowledge, and all understanding. Before we can truly do physics, we must understand how physics is even possible for creatures who are themselves part of the system they study. The story core, the sentence that reads itself. To feel this, imagine that you are a character inside a novel. Not just any character, but a detective whose mission is to solve the mystery. Who wrote this book, and what are its rules? You walk around inside the story. You talk to other characters. You examine clues. You notice recurring themes and patterns in how events unfold. But everything you touch is made of the same thing: words. The buildings, the streets, the objects, the people, even your own body and thoughts are made of sentences laid down by the author. When you study the ink on the page, you are studying words made of ink, using eyes and a brain also made of ink. You are using the language to study the language. This is our situation in the holophase picture. We are phi patterns, trying to understand phi. Every measurement we make, every observation we record, every theory we write down is itself a pattern in phi. There is no clean separation between us and the universe. We are specific regions of the universe, studying other regions of the universe. The remarkable fact is that this works at all. A sentence in a book can, in some sense, learn about the structure of the book. A character can notice that every chapter starts the same way, or that certain words keep coming back. In the same way, patterns in phi can discover regularities in phi. We can find laws of motion, symmetries, conservation principles, and even the idea that there might be a single field beneath everything. But there are deep limits. The sentence in the book cannot jump out of the pages to look at the whole novel from above. The character cannot interview the author outside the story. Our knowledge is always partial, approximate, and from the inside. Epistemic access is the study of this inside view, how it works, how far it can go, and what its necessary boundaries are. 2. Linguistic role. The language talking about itself. In our language metaphor, epistemic access is the point where language becomes self-aware. It is the birth of a meta-language, a language for talking about the language. When we study English grammar, we use English sentences to talk about English rules. We say things like, a noun is the name of a person, place, or thing. That sentence is made of the very symbols it is describing. It is a loop. In the Holophase framework, science and mathematics are our meta-language. When we write an equation like force equals mass times acceleration, we are using patterns in phi, the movement of our hands, the activation of neurons, the ink on paper, the pixels on a screen, to describe other patterns in phi, the motion of planets, the fall of an apple, the vibration of a string. The miracle is that this works at all. The universe is not just chaotic noise. It has stable regularities that can be captured in simple rules. Even more amazingly, those rules can be discovered and encoded by small subsystems inside the universe, like human brains. Epistemic access is this miracle made explicit. It is phi developing patterns that talk about phi. It is the language turning around and saying, let me describe myself. 3. Scientific essence. Self-knowledge from the inside. Scientifically, the core question of epistemic access is this. Given that we are phi patterns, how can we reconstruct information about phi and its derivative structure from the limited, noisy, internal signals available to us? Let's make this concrete with the example of sound. Sound is a pattern of pressure variations in air, a particular expression of phi in the medium of molecules. You hear a note from a violin. You want to know its frequency, its loudness, perhaps even the shape of the waveform. The original phi pattern, the sound wave, travels through the air and reaches your eardrum. Your eardrum is itself a physical system, a membrane that vibrates in response. Those vibrations are transformed into neural signals, encoded as electrical and chemical patterns in your auditory nerves. Those signals reach your brain, where billions of neurons, themselves phi patterns, process, compare, and interpret the incoming information. At the end of this chain, a new phi pattern appears in your cortex, the experience and recognition of a 440 Hz A note, or the feeling of a bright, sharp tone. You have gained knowledge about a distant phi pattern, using intermediate phi patterns in your body as a channel. This shows several important features of epistemic access. First, knowledge is never a direct copy of reality. It is always a reconstruction. The original wave had a continuous structure in space and time. By the time it becomes a perception, much of that detail has been compressed, filtered, and transformed. Second, knowledge is always relative to a particular mode of access. If your ears were different, or if you had sensors tuned to other features of the wave, you would have a different experience of the same underlying phi pattern. Third, even with all these limitations, the reconstruction can still be amazingly accurate in the aspects that matter. Musicians can distinguish tiny differences in pitch. Scientists can measure frequencies to extraordinary precision using instruments that are, at their core, still phi coupled to phi. So the question is not, can we know phi perfectly? The answer to that is clearly no. The question is, how can phi know enough about itself through internal channels to build reliable models of its own behavior? 4. Dimensional expression, knowing through time, space, and motion. We access phi's patterns through all three echoes, temporal, spatial, and motional. And each channel brings both power and limits. Through the time echo, we gain access to order and rhythm. We can tell before and after. We can feel duration. and we can build clocks that convert cycles into numbers. Our brains are particularly sensitive to temporal patterns. We can hear beats, we can follow speech, we can anticipate events. But there is a limit to our temporal resolution. Very fast events blend into a continuous impression. Very slow changes feel invisible until they become large. Our conscious experience seems to sample reality in chunks, not infinitesimal instants. Through the space echo, we gain access to form and separation. We see shapes, edges, and distances. We build rulers, cameras, microscopes, and telescopes to extend our reach. But again, resolution is finite. There is a smallest length scale we can currently probe, and beyond that, quantum effects and instrument limits blur our access. There is also a largest scale beyond which information cannot reach us in finite time, set by the finiteness of the speed of light and the age of the universe. Through the motion echo, we gain access to change and relation. We can measure speeds, accelerations, flows, and rotations. We feel forces through muscle tension. We build accelerometers and gyroscopes. But our access to motion is always relative. We can only compare one motion to another. There is no privileged, at rest viewpoint inside phi. Every real act of knowing uses all three echoes together. When we measure the length of an object with a laser, the light takes time to travel, and both the source and the detector might be moving. When we infer the mass of a star from the orbit of a planet, we are reading a spatial pattern over time and interpreting the motion. Our epistemic access is therefore inherently tridimensional. We never see the entire infinite jet of derivatives. We see specific projections of that infinite structure along our time, space, and motion channels. V. Position in the master tree, the tree growing eyes. Within the master tree of phi and its derivatives, epistemic access appears as a special sort of feedback loop, the tree growing eyes that look at itself. Our bodies, brains, and instruments are not separate from the tree. They are very elaborate branches, shaped by the same dynamics as everything else. Our nervous system is a branch that developed the ability to form internal maps of external patterns. A scientific community is a forest of such branches, exchanging models and refining them. When these branches develop the ability to represent not just raw signals, but also rules that generate those signals, the tree becomes self-modeling. It can carry inside itself compressed descriptions of its own behavior. It can, in a limited way, predict itself. This is where epistemic access lives on the master tree. In the high branches where phi has built organisms and minds that carry nested models of reality within them. Those models are themselves phi patterns that point back to other phi patterns. It is a system of self-reference, but one that has grown naturally from the ground of the field, not one imposed from outside. 6. Relations to neighbors, building knowledge from all our tools. All the abstract structures we have explored play a role in epistemic access. Basic derivatives give us our most direct handles on change. We feel velocities and accelerations in our bodies. We see gradients in light and color. These are our first encounters with omega and k. Quadratic forms show up as intensities. Loudness, brightness, temperature, and energy all feel like how much of something is present. These sensations are our nervous system's coarse translation of squared derivatives and density-like quantities into a single intuitive scale. Topology appears in our ability to notice qualitative differences that cannot be removed by smooth deformations. We can distinguish a loop from a line, a knot from an unknot, a linked pair of rings from separate ones. In physics, this shows up in our ability to detect discrete charges, quantized vortices, and robust patterns that survive perturbations. Holonomy and global effects show up when we detect that going around the loop matters. The famous Aharonov-Bohm effect is an example. Particles pick up a phase shift even when they travel through regions with no local field, because of the global structure of the potential. Our instruments become sensitive to phi's path-dependent memory. Spectral decomposition shows up in our use of Fourier analysis and similar tools. We break complicated patterns into sums of simple waves because our epistemic systems find it easier to understand and manipulate these building blocks. This is a powerful way of compressing information about phi into a form we can grasp. Information theory ties it together by telling us that knowing is always about reducing uncertainty among possibilities. When we learn, we rule out many potential phi configurations and narrow down to a smaller subset compatible with our data. All of these are aspects of epistemic access, different ways in which phi, through us, gains knowledge about its own unfolding. 7. Semantic meaning. Why knowing matters. What practical work does epistemic access do in the universe? First, it enables control and agency. A pattern that can model its environment can anticipate threats and opportunities. It can act in ways that preserve its structure and increase its chances of persisting. Life is, in large part, phi learning to build accurate local models of phi and using them to steer its own trajectory. Second, it enables cooperation and culture. Once patterns can share models with each other through communication, knowledge becomes cumulative. Each generation does not have to rediscover fire or the wheel from scratch. Phi, through culture, stores models of its own behavior in stories, equations, and traditions that outlive individual brains. Third, it enables reflection and meaning. Epistemic access makes it possible not only to survive, but to ask questions like, what am I? And what is this universe? It allows phi to become not only a physical process, but also a reflective process, aware of itself as a process. In this sense, knowing is one of phi's most profound activities. Through epistemic access, the universe does not just exist, it understands itself, however partially. 8. Stability and falsifiability, testing the limits of knowing. Because epistemic access is a real physical process, it is also subject to scientific testing. If our holophase model claims that certain aspects of phi should be knowable in principle, then we should be able to design experiments that approach that principled limit. If we consistently fail, we learn something important. For example, suppose the holophase framework predicts that certain topological features of the field must leave measurable imprints in correlation patterns between particles. We design experiments to look for those correlations, pushing our detectors to their quantum limits. If we find the predicted signatures, our picture of epistemic access is strengthened. We really can see the deep structure through clever measurement. If we do not find them, we must reconsider. Perhaps our mapping from theory to experiment was flawed. Perhaps we underestimated noise, or perhaps our belief about what is knowable from within phi was too optimistic. In an even deeper sense, the very existence of fundamental limits like the uncertainty principle can be seen as an expression of self-referential constraints. A system cannot carry a full, perfectly sharp description of its own state within itself without contradiction. So there is a built-in trade-off between what can be known at once and what must remain indeterminate. The holophase view does not erase these limits. It tries to show how they arise naturally from the fact that phi is both the subject and the object of all possible experiments. 9. Examples across scales. The partial gaze of a self-knowing world. You can see the character of epistemic access at work in many familiar situations. When a doctor diagnoses an illness, they never directly see the complete state of the body. They rely on symptoms, test results, images, and statistics. From these partial glimpses, they reconstruct a probable pattern, an infection, a deficiency, a malfunction. Their knowledge is an internal model that tracks the essential features reasonably well, but leaves enormous detail unknown. When meteorologists forecast the weather, they do not know the exact position and velocity of every molecule in the atmosphere. They sample pressure, temperature, and humidity at many locations, feed these into equations, and generate probabilistic forecasts. Their epistemic access is coarse-grained and noisy, but still sufficient to predict storms and heat waves. When neuroscientists study the brain, they do not have direct access to every neuron's firing at every millisecond. They rely on tools like fMRI, EEG, and animal recordings, each with severe limits. They build models of cognition and consciousness from blurred, partial data. Our self knowledge as minds is even more indirect. We have introspection, which itself is a phi process observing other phi processes, with its own biases and blind spots. When astronomers study distant galaxies, they receive a tiny trickle of photons that have traveled for billions of years. From these faint signals, they reconstruct the structure, motion, and history of vast systems. Here, the extremes of distance and time emphasize the gap between the full reality and the thin slice of it we directly access. In each of these cases, phi is learning about phi through incomplete channels. The reconstructions are never perfect, but they are good enough to guide action, refine theories, and deepen understanding. Human analogies. The dot in the painting. One helpful analogy is to imagine a vast painting stretching far beyond your vision. Now imagine that you are a single tiny dot of paint on that canvas, and somehow you become aware. You can feel the colors immediately around you. You can perhaps sense the way the brushstrokes flow nearby. If other nearby dots are also aware, you can exchange information and gradually build a local map of the painting. Over long periods of communication and inference, you and your neighboring dots might come to suspect that you are part of a larger pattern, a tree, a face, a landscape. You might deduce rules about how colors tend to combine or how lines tend to curve. But you can never leave the canvas to see the whole painting from the outside. Your knowledge will always be partial, perspectival, and dependent on the kinds of signals that can travel between dots. This is our epistemic situation in the Holophase universe. We have phi at a point, plus a small neighborhood, trying to understand phi as a whole. 11. Recognition skill. Watching yourself. No. You can cultivate an awareness of epistemic access by noticing, in real time, the difference between reality and your model of reality. When you look at your hand, remember that what you experience is a processed construction. Light waves bouncing off your skin, passing through your eyes, being transformed by your retina and brain into a coherent image. Beneath that image are molecules, fields, and derivatives you never see directly. When you form an opinion about someone, recognize that it is a model built from limited data. A few conversations, some body language, maybe a history of interactions. The full phi pattern that constitutes that person's mind and life is vastly richer than your model. When you feel certain about a belief, remind yourself that certainty is a state of a neural network, not a guarantee of truth. Your brain is a phi machine, specialized for survival and social interaction, not for perfect metaphysical accuracy. This gentle awareness does not paralyze you. It simply adds humility and openness to your knowing. It honors the fact that, as phi, you are doing your best to know phi, using limited channels in a vast and subtle universe. 12. Return to phi, the field that writes and reads itself. We end, as always, by returning to the central vision. There is one field, phi. It differentiates into time, space, and motion. It weaves itself into particles, fields, bodies, and minds. Among those minds are some that turn around and ask, what is this? What am I made of? How does this all work? Epistemic access is phi reading its own script. It is the language discovering that it is a language. It is the universe looking into a mirror it has built out of neurons, telescopes, accelerators, and questions. Our knowledge will always be incomplete. There will always be horizons we cannot cross and details we cannot resolve. But the fact that any self-knowledge is possible at all is already astonishing. In the Holophase view, you are not an outsider trying to decode a foreign universe. You are the universe, in one of its most intricate patterns, trying to understand its own language. Every time you learn, reflect, or wonder, phi is folding back on itself in a new way. This brings Episode 8, the pure abstract language, to its natural conclusion. We have built the language from its first letter. We have explored its grammar, its universality, its mapping to physics, its reality filter, and now its self-knowledge. From here, our journey will descend into the concrete. In the next episode, we will let Phi put on familiar clothes. mass, force, charge, light, matter, and life. We will see how the abstract structures we have built become the everyday world. 13. Zooming out. Epistemic access in the Holophase roadmap. Before we close, let us place epistemic access inside the wider journey of the Holophase roadmap so you can feel your position in the overall story. From the very beginning, we said that reality is not a heap of separate things, but a single continuous cyclic field. We showed how the first differentiation of phi gives birth to time as omega, space as k, and motion as v. We then climbed the master tree of derivatives, watching more and more refined questions about change appear, and with them, the rich structures of waves, topological patterns, holonomy, and informational constraints. In this climb, you might at times have felt like an outside observer, looking at diagrams on a board. Epistemic access corrects that feeling. It reminds you that there is no outside. The chalk, the board, the equations, the lecturer, the listener, the microphone, the recording, the headphones, all of them are configurations of the same underlying field. The very act of explanation is phi reorganizing itself so that one part carries a compressed model that can be unfolded in another part. This is why the Holophase program insists so strongly that energy, information, and language are not three different things, but three ways of describing the same activity of patterning. Energy is how intense the pattern is. Information is how many alternatives it excludes. Language is how that pattern can be recombined and transmitted. Epistemic access is where all three meet: intense enough to be stable in a brain, specific enough to rule out wrong models, and structured enough to be shared with others. You can now look back on Episode 8 as the phase where phi learned to describe itself in a pure, implementation-free way. And you can look at this final part as the moment where that pure description reconnects with lived reality, with you here, listening, thinking, and perhaps feeling a shift in how you see the world. As we move forward into the more concrete episodes, you can carry this awareness with you. Whenever we talk about fields, particles, forces, or symmetries, remember that the very knowledge of those things is itself a holophase event. The equations are phi, the experiments are phi, the interpretations and confusions and breakthroughs are phi. In that sense, the entire Holophase project is not just a theory about the universe. It is an exercise the universe is doing through us, a long, careful breath of self-reflection in the life of a single field that never began and will never end. And each time you revisit these ideas, you allow that field to refine its own understanding, sharpening its mirror and deepening its quiet, luminous awareness within. For now, pause and feel this. You are a wave in phi, listening to phi's story about itself. You are both the written line and the reader of the page. In this unity of language and listener lies the heart of the Holophase vision. Salam, and peace be upon you.